When I first saw that the indie debut release Asterigos Curse of the Stars was developed by a company calling themselves ACME Studios, I thought, oh no, this game is going to be an explosive disaster because they seem to have purposefully associated themselves with a Looney Tunes company that sold poor old Wiley Coyote a range of faulty products that would consistently fail with hilarious consequences.
Yeah, I bought a giant life-size slingshot from you, and it just slammed me into a mountain.
Sorry, no returns.
But after doing a little research into the name ACME, it actually comes from the Greek translation of acme, meaning the peak or the highest point, and with Asterigos being a thematically Greek Souls-like game, I hope that doesn't mean ACME Studios have cornered themselves into designing Greek-themed games only. Anyway, I still fired it up and I said, hold your massive Greek Trojan horses. This game is far from a faulty product that leads to hilarious consequences. This game is absolutely bloody brilliant. Honestly, I cannot put this down. It just keeps pushing me forward to the point where I'm annoyed to be here speaking to you right now when I could be slicing a massive purple minotaur up by combining some badass sword and spear combo moves. That's right, you heard me correctly. Combining two weapons into one moveset is a very real possibility, and such a refreshing and authentic take on any third-person combat mechanic that I've ever seen. Within 5 minutes of playing Asterigos, we're handed all the tools we need to compete with the toughest Greek mythologies around. We start and end the game with a sword and shield, a spear, a hammer, twin daggers, a staff for long range attacks, and a pair of bracelets for a more strategic approach. You don't just carry two weapons at once, you'll be wielding two weapons at once, and this has been executed seamlessly to the point where I'm wondering why nobody else has thought of this before. Each weapon has a standard attack and a technique attack, so the sword and shield has the ability to block using the shield, the dagger's technique is a sliding dodge, providing more iframes and a bigger window of invulnerability when dodging. The hammer has a devastating charge attack technique. The spear provides the ability to parry incoming enemy attacks and follow up with a wounding counter attack of your own. The staff's technique is this charged ray attack that can be fired from a distance, and the bracelet's technique plants these magic landmines that'll wait for an enemy's footstep. So on a controller, which is the recommended way to play the game by the way, your X and Y or square and triangle buttons are your standard attacks and the left bumper and left trigger are your technique attacks. It's as simple as that. You can change the controller layout of course, but the recommended worked fine for me. Now you'll have to find your two favourite weapons to combine because you'll be pouring talent points into your favourite two weapons within this huge perk tree as you progress. Some of the lesser perks will have a small trade-off, like you can dodge earlier but it'll cost you more stamina to do so, but as you move through the tree you'll gain access to these gold stars that unlock new talents associated with certain weapons. These talents require magic stardust to execute in battle, and some moves being more powerful and therefore costing more than others, with a magic bar in the bottom of the right hand corner being your gauge. They fill up as you successfully hit an enemy. My personal favourite weapon combo was the sword and shield combined with the spear, because this felt closest to a traditional Souls-like feel to the combat, with the sword and shield letting me block with the left bumper and the spear letting me parry incoming attacks with the left trigger, but you might have to find your own preference. Each weapon feels gratifyingly different from another, and the combat feels mostly impactful. The odd standard attack can feel a little light and feathery with no hit detection or enemy animation for some of them, but then certain moves or your technique attacks will stagger and knock down enemies, which feels really good to pull off. You can switch your elemental damage at the press of a button too, which comes in handy depending on the situation, using fire to ignite these bags of old flour for example, putting out fires with ice, or destroying a magic barrier with astral damage. The enemy AI can be a little off though sadly, especially anything that moved quickly like the lions or the flying sirens, sometimes being restricted to the fighting areas and passively returning to them if they leave that area, and often being caught on objects too. The combat mechanics on the whole though are really impressive. You'll also be unlocking attribute points as you progress, which are spent on the main attributes: Precision, which is your attack power, Constitution, which is your health, and Arcane, which is your magic point recovery and skill damage rate. The currency in Asterigos is Stardust, which you'll collect with every enemy that you defeat, and dying will cost you 10% of that, and you can't retrieve it from your corpse either. What's interesting though is you don't spend it on leveling up. In fact, you'll level up in a more traditional RPG sense by simply progressing through the story. So with less importance being placed on the currency, there's less importance being placed on staying alive. Instead, you'll be spending Stardust on consumables at the character Quintus, this mouthy little merchant whose inventory can be expanded by finding a bag of his goodies out in the world, and also at the character Vulcane, a foxy little fox that'll craft you some new trinkets to add some protective buffs, and best of all, she'll even increase your weapon's damage output. It's not all purchased with Stardust that you've accumulated though, as through random drops and exploring the world, you'll need to find different materials to unlock the next level of a weapon or craft that new trinket blueprint that you've found. Now that brings me on to exploration. There's no armor system in the game other than cosmetic skins to change, and as mentioned, you'll start the game with all your weapons, and as a result, the exploration can feel a little less rewarding than a traditional Souls-like game where wandering off the beaten path can lead to a game-changing weapon, but in Asterigos, you'll only be finding quest-related items, consumables, and materials. It's not a huge bummer though, because the 6 weapons we start with are so dynamic within their own moveset that you'll be spending the entire game being rewarded by this system alone. The level design is okay, it's definitely not quite as intricate as a Dark Souls game, and although I still found some satisfaction in unlocking the shortcuts, I never really had much of a use for them until much later into the game because the quests kept pushing me in a linear direction and rarely had me backtracking. The bonfire system in Asterigos shouldn't be compared to any bonfire system in truth. They're called conduits, and it's a checkpoint and that's it. You can't upgrade anything at these conduits and you can't even travel from them. It's just simply a checkpoint, and resting at one will reset the enemies. All of your character upgrades can be done within the pause menu, which actually pauses the game by the way, and crafting and quest progression has to be done within the shelter, which acts as the hub throughout the game, and travelling back here requires a Rhodus symbol, which is a consumable, and thankfully I've not run out of these yet as they've been plentiful, but no idea how I'd get back if I'd used them all up. And then there's the placements of these conduits. They've gone old school Dark Souls, being really spaced out and forcing me to endure a massive trek back to the boss is something that nobody enjoys in all honesty. These conduits offer very little to the game, and it's a little bit disappointing to see how they've been implemented. Huge emphasis has been placed on the story, which I'm not going to spoil, but in a nutshell we play as Hilda, a brave and pretty cocky Northwind Legion warrior looking to find her lost father, and enters a mythical and cursed city known as Aphes, and along the way you'll uncover a violent and political struggle within the city of Aphes. Now if you're into Greek mythology, you'll adore Asterigos because it's unbelievably rich with lore and it's got a really dense narrative, but from my point of view there's almost too much lore. The game is littered with notes to read and dialogue to take part in, some of which is voice acted, some of which isn't. I love the idea of knocking on doors to hear secrets and unlock side quests to complete. This was really cool, but I felt that some of this lore offered very little to the overarching plotline, which was a really good plotline, and instead there were times when it started to just get in the way of the action that I was so eager to dive into. You'll be finding and listening to these magical echoes too, a recent moment that's been captured to eavesdrop in on, and I've never been a fan of this method of storytelling in truth. It might feel voyeuristic at first, but it negates any meaningful connection I might have with these certain characters because actually meeting them in person was a rare occurrence. That may be a little critical because like I said, the base plotline is good, but there's a ton of unnecessary fluff around that I can see a lot of people eventually skipping it over. Now I'm a big fan of cel-shaded art styles, and here we've got a nice little mashup of Immortals Phoenix Rising and Kena Bridge of Spirits, and what surprised me most was how it didn't detract from a Souls-like genre, which is normally associated with much grittier tones and a grimier colour palette. It definitely feels more light and playful as a result, but with these 3 difficulty options to choose from, there's nothing light and playful about the hard setting of Asterigos, which Dark Souls veterans should definitely aim for. The textures on the whole can look a little washed out at times, and there's some glaringly obvious texture streaming issues when entering a new area that can cause the odd stutter here and there, and some pretty ugly popping as well. But this wasn't a regular occurrence, thankfully, and ultimately this vibrantly lush setting made a pretty decent home for a Souls-like adventure that'll easily take up to 30, maybe even 40 hours to complete in its entirety. It is a very demanding game though, with AMD FSR fidelity mode being helped to alleviate those demands on PC, and on next-gen consoles it's limited to 1080p to achieve that 60 FPS. Around £30 or $35 on all platforms, this is absolutely worth your time though. The third-person attempts to compete with the Souls-like genre have often been found wanting, with only really Mortal Shell and The Surge being decent entries into the genre. In my opinion, Asterigos is definitely another decent entry into this genre, and with this being an indie developer ACME's debut title, it might not quite live up to the actual FromSoft experience, because what game does, but this is an astonishing achievement to make such an ambitious game with a fraction of the resources compared to other developers. Let me know your thoughts on what you've seen so far though. Have you already picked this one up? And if so, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.